Live from Singapore, essential business news as it breaks and a look at the economic news that will shape the day. This is BBC World News and Asia Business Report.
Record sales for Alibaba's Singles Day mega shopping event this year, but the Chinese tech giant isn't sounding the gong this time. And as the COP26 climate summit begins to close, we'll take stock of the promises made this year by world leaders. Hello and welcome to Asia Business Report. I'm Karishma Vaswani. Well, Alibaba's landmark shopping festival Singles Day has posted record sales. It was a high-stakes event this year, the first since China's government crackdown on technology companies. The world's second biggest economy is also facing a number of challenges. Well, for all of this, we can talk to our business reporter, Suranjana Tawari, who's been going through the numbers for us. Suranjana, great to have you on the program. They were a pretty impressive set of figures, weren't they?
That's right, Karishma. More than $80 billion worth of goods moved on the platform during the shopping festival, an 8% increase since last year. But what a lot of people are pointing to is the pace of sales growth.
Hello there. This weekend we should see
the slowest since Singles Day started, and definitely slower than the 26% that it reported last year. So why does this matter? Well, Singles Day is often used as a barometer to check the health of the Chinese economy. And that's because it's not just Alibaba, but a lot of other private enterprises, e-commerce companies that have really piggybacked the festival and, offer sales, and people often buy a lot of goods during that time. But we know that the Chinese economy is facing a lot of challenges. There's a supply crunch, there are power shortages, and there are COVID lockdowns which are really dampening retail sales and consumption in general. But there's another political element to all of this. This Singles Day is happening against the backdrop of a regulation crackdown from the Chinese government. Alibaba has been summoned, as have a number of other tech companies, with the government really looking into how big they are and how they operate exactly. Alibaba was even fined earlier this year for anti-competition practices. Now, Alibaba, in its results of the shopping festival, was rather muted. It really focused on sustainability and how its packaging was more environmentally friendly, very different from the glitz and glamour of previous years. And that suggests, to some experts at least, that the government that it is recognizing the heat it's facing from the government as well.
Suranjana Tawari there explaining the political dynamics behind Alibaba's Singles Day. Meanwhile, the marquee event of APEC, the Leaders' Summit, begins tonight. Both Presidents Biden and Xi are expected to attend ahead of their virtual meeting next week. Our Asia business correspondent Mariko Oy has more on what to expect.
We've already heard from the Chinese President Xi Jinping addressing the CEO summit, warning against a return to Cold War-era divisions. That comment came only hours after Washington and Beijing announced that surprise pact to accelerate climate action at COP26 in Glasgow. Now, both Presidents Biden and Xi are attending tonight's Leaders' Summit, and while they shook hands on climate, they are expected to go through a number of contentious issues when they meet again virtually next week. And there will be a lot to get through. There have been growing tensions over issues like trade, Hong Kong, human rights in Xinjiang, and Taiwan. Now, both Taiwan and China want to join that regional trade pact, the CPTPP. Beijing opposes Taiwan's entry, but the APEC host, New Zealand, left the door open to both of them to join, while Australia continues to object to Beijing's entry until they resolve their trade tensions. Later tonight, we're expecting to hear from President Biden, who only last week criticized China for not showing up at COP26. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern is also expected to announce an APEC roadmap for the next 20 years to build back better post-pandemic, borrowing a phrase from Mr. Biden. Because of the time difference, the Leaders Summit will only start at midnight New Zealand time, and it will be held all virtually, just like all the other events that took place this week. If you remember, back in 2019, the annual APEC summit in Chile had to be cancelled because of protests. And last year it was hosted by Malaysia virtually, but at a much smaller scale. So this is the first full summit held all virtually, and it is quite impressive how New Zealand has managed to pull this off.
Well, on to another summit now, the key COP26 summit wrapping up later today, and we can take the temperature of the pledges made over the last 2 weeks. The US and China, as Mariko was just saying there, say they will work towards keeping global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's a goal set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement, actually. And the COP26 draft agreement calls out fossil fuels as the main culprits of climate change for the first time. Now, major financial institutions with a combined net worth of around $130 trillion have also said they want to help bring global emissions down to zero. Juan Pablo Osornio is the head of the Greenpeace delegation at the summit. He told me progress has been slow.
So what we're seeing right now is private companies want to double count emission reductions, and that would blow a hole on the Paris Agreement. It's terrible news for environmentalists all over and for the world at large.
Just on the Paris Agreement, you know, we've seen in the last couple of days China and the US pledging to work together. It's being touted as a huge step forward. But in a way, aren't we just repeating history again?
Well, I think if you consider the broader geopolitics around it, and you see these two coming together and basically sending a message to the world that they might disagree in other areas, but on this one, cooperation is needed. I thought it was a good restart of the relationship. And I think this actually puts the floor on what we can expect. And it's up to both of them and the rest of the world to actually increase what the commitments have been in what we saw in the declaration yesterday.
We've seen some pretty impressive promises from financial companies at COP26. Are you seeing that they're getting serious about climate change?
Well, we're skeptical. They talk a big game, but unless you see accountability, transparency, and reporting on all of these initiatives, we don't think they're going to amount to much.
What kind of commitments do you think we need at COP26 from private companies then?
If companies are going to be very serious about this, they need to stop investing on fossil fuels. They need to retire their fossil fuel assets without actually sweating them or selling them. And they need to start lobbying governments to be in favor of decarbonizing their economies.
Are governments doing enough to push emissions, to push businesses rather, to cap emissions?
No, I don't think so. And that's what we're here to do, to remind them. They need to come back every year after this with more ambition, with higher targets, and with more implementation until the gap towards 1.5 degrees Celsius is closed.
Well, one of the other big issues at COP26 has been the transition to renewable energy. And India has been pitching for a transnational grid to share solar power with the UK and other countries. But can solar energy really meet the energy needs of the Indian population? The BBC's Davina Gupta went to a solar village near India's capital, Delhi, and sent us this report.
For Guddu Khan, getting electricity from the sun didn't seem possible until 3 years ago when he bought his home in Kakrala village on the outskirts of Delhi. With no source of electricity, he turned to solar power.
I bought my home, but there was no provision of electricity here because it is an unplanned cluster. So I started thinking of alternatives. I saw a video about solar energy on YouTube and contacted the local vendors to install it. I had to save up nearly $300, but it was worth it.
Just like him, at least 800 homes in this village have installed solar panels to generate power. Some have invested in bigger solar panels that store more electricity and can even power air conditioner during the hot summer months.
The only problem is during rainy days, when we have to cut down on our daily usage because less power is generated and we have to use whatever is stored in the battery.
Over 80% of power generated in India comes from fossil fuels. India has an ambitious target of achieving 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And solar power forms a crucial part of that plan. While many consumers are making that shift, the road ahead is still quite difficult.
34-year-old Amol has been trying for the past 3 years to tap into the demand for rooftop solar panels and says it's a tough market.
We need investments to scale up. But in today's economy, it's difficult to get credit. then 90% of our raw material comes from China. And with changing political ties, we are facing severe shortage of solar cells and panels.
The Indian government has recently earmarked nearly $500 million to ramp up production of solar components in the country. And 16 companies, including the big titans like oil-to-energy conglomerate Reliance Industries, are in the race to build these factories.
The next couple of years, you'll start seeing a lot of new capacities coming up in India. And that will actually give India the opportunity of emerging as an alternative supply chain to China, which I think is very important, especially given now all the risk issues of having all your eggs in one basket, as it were.
Now, the next challenge for India is to ensure those in cities and villages can afford to use solar power so that renewable energy can have its moment under the sun here. Devina Gupta, BBC News, Delhi.
That's all the time that we have for you in this edition of Asia Business Report. Thanks so much for watching. Do stay with BBC News.